This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. Have you been thinking about therapy? Have you been trying to get in to see a therapist? Have you found that a lot of therapists that you've been recommended to have either closed books or they've got a really long waiting list? Sometimes months. If you're lucky, it's a couple of weeks. Now, what if there was an alternative that gave you quicker access and at your convenience? So when starting to think about looking for a therapist, try BetterHelp. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient and flexible to your schedule needs. So just fill out the brief questionnaire and get matched with a registered therapist. You can also switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. So get moving with therapy and visit BetterHelp. BetterHelp.com/Gunter today will give you 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/Gunter, GUNTER.
Listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. To guide us through the intricacies and intersections of emotions, relationships, and male identity is renowned psychologist, author, and speaker Gunter Swoboda. This is Inspire Change.
Before I begin the actual podcast, I would like to respectfully acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I work. I would also like to pay my respects to their elders past and present. Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspire Change with Gunter. I'm your host. Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspire Change with Gunter. Before we get into the body of today's podcast, I need to make an amendment. In the last episode, I had basically a brain fart, and it actually happened because I over-relied on technology. So herein lies the lesson, folks. I have a tendency to script out the content for the podcast, so I track along in a logical and rational and objective way, and not get too caught up with segues, which without a script I can be prone to do. So what am I referring to? Well, my references were to Professor Greg Downey, not Dyer. The autocorrect in my system decided that Dyer was the thing, to put in rather than Downey. So, dear Professor Greg Downey, my deep apologies for my brain fart on this particular occasion, and henceforth we'll check the content much, much more thoroughly. So just a lesson to everybody, whether you're using AI or whether you're just writing it yourself in a word processor and you have autocorrect, please pay attention. All right. So I want to carry on a little bit from our last podcast where I talked about the whole idea of the constructed self and the authentic self. And I want to take this a little bit further and deeper into a realm that's constantly being discussed, but I'm not necessarily sure we're getting a lot of traction on this particular topic. And that is fundamentally about men embracing emotional vulnerability. He says. Yep. One of the very scary areas in our lives, and I'm not sure I've got to confine this to men. I do believe, having worked with couples for around 30 or so years, that women too are often not necessarily emotionally vulnerable in their relationship, in their intimate relationship with men. They may be often a lot more with their, girlfriends and other women, but certainly my experience is that a lot of women are actually not allowing themselves to be completely authentic in their relationships. So, what is it that I'm saying? Essentially, I am talking about the relationship between vulnerability and authenticity, right? Now, there's another concept involved in this, which is about honesty. Um, and so, I think what we need to do is take a look at sort of the dynamics in those three areas. So, honesty, possibly transparency, vulnerability, and authenticity. So, I want to explore this because it's fundamentally crucial for emotional health. And it's also very, very, very important in our intimate relationships. Again, let me reference back to my work as a couples therapist. And I wasn't doing just couples. Obviously, when you're in private practice, you do a relatively good mix. And at a certain point, you end up often choosing a particular direction that you want to go in. And I decided at a certain point that I wanted to stop working with couples and focus my attention on adolescent boys and men. Okay, nothing against couples, okay? Just energy wise, time wise, and interest wise, uh, my whole orientation became much, much more focused on men's issues, boys and men's issues. So the other area that I want to bring into play here is that notion of emotional literacy. So let's start the conversation on vulnerability, authenticity, and the pathway to emotional well-being. Okay, so first things first. If you are purely operating from your constructed self and you are not necessarily being consistently authentic, which in some areas of our society is difficult in the first place, then you're probably not making yourself as vulnerable in the social environment, the social milieu as you possibly could. And so one of the effects of that is that we are not getting the depth of relationships that we could have. And for a lot of us, we may need to be less authentic at work because that could bring some interesting issues up. But we don't necessarily come home, take the armor off, the constructed self, and open myself up authentically to my partner and my kids. We still keep coming from that, constructed self. And, patriarchal men are stuck in the construct of self. They're not in an authentic place. And I'd like, if someone wants to argue with me on this, I'm happy to do it because, it's very straightforward. And so if we talk about, our culture, for men, there's actually a stigma about being vulnerable. Boys are told not to cry. They're told to buckle up, get on with it, act a man, all those sorts of stereotypical things. Now, some of you out there are going to go, oh, yeah, but, that was then, this is now, and we're a lot better, and so on. That may be the case in some areas, but I can tell you now that if you're in a peer group in a boys' school, not much has changed from that. So for too long in that sort of environment, men have been taught that showing emotion or admitting uncertainty is a sign of weakness. Now, that admitting of uncertainty or wrongness or being accountable actually is a really huge issue for a lot of men. It's sort of like, can't admit I made a mistake, I could be wrong, I may not be sure. So we clutch at proverbial straws to maintain the construct. Now, my experience is that clutching on straws generally leads to a serious case of drowning. This belief that, we shouldn't show emotional, that uncertainty is an admission of weakness, is in itself a cornerstone of the constructed self. It's a persona developed in response to social expectation. But consider the cost of this, right? We know that internalizing, suppressing, and repressing emotions can lead not just to anxiety, depression, and a disconnection from others, but there's some relatively decent research out there that shows that it actually has an impact on our physical well-being. So, in the framework of making good men great, one of the things that I set out is to help men challenge this stigma and recognize that vulnerability is not a weakness, but in fact a profound strength. That in of itself, it's a gateway to genuine connections. It's also a gateway to self-acceptance and therefore ultimately emotional resilience. Rather than beating yourself up because you don't know something, you made a mistake, you're not perfect, you go, I'm human, I'm fallible. And with the right attitude, I will address whatever shortcomings there are in me or about me in the best possible way. All right. Now, unfortunately, one of the issues with this whole, stigma on vulnerability is that it's really restricted men's emotional vocabulary and literacy. So not only are we having difficulties reading emotions often in ourselves, but we're often really unclear what's happening for, especially in an intimate relationship, to my partner. We often come in and we make an assumption that she's got the shits with me. Well, the first question is, well, how do you know that? Well, there's a very dense cloud hanging over the living room. Yeah, but that still doesn't tell me whether she's got the shits with you or she's upset about something else. So, emotional intelligence, let it kick in. So what are you going to do? You're going to actually reach out and go, honey, are you okay? And not with trepidation, but with rather a rich tone of concern. Lean in to the conflict. It's like, where do we get the best pace out of a sailing boat? When the boat's leaning into the wind, where it's really the sails are full with the wind that's coming our way. So, emotional vulnerability has to start with emotional literacy and a strong emotional vocabulary. The ability to recognize, understand, and articulate our feelings. And where are we going to get that from? Well, as an adult, therapy is a good place to start. It may also be that you can, read. Reading helps to expand that. Listening mindfully to poetry, to audio books, to watching movies. Not just action movies, because they're rather depleted of emotional language in most cases, not all, unless the hero's dying, in which case we get a different scenario, right? But, this is learnable. We're not inarticulate because it's in our genetic makeup. They're just, it's a nonsense. When people say to me, oh, boys will be boys, and so when they're 12, 13, 14, they will just grunt at you. Well, if you're a decent parent, you will challenge your child about the grunting bit. Apart from the fact that grunting at me is somewhat disrespectful. I'd like a bit more contact, a bit more, communication, and that's verbal. I'll pick up on the rest of it. That's my job. So it's about encouraging, people to learn, to open up. So this whole thing is a critical step towards dismantling the barriers that we've built around ourselves, our heart and soul and our mind. Often, even asking a lot of men about, well, what are you thinking? Is they are apprehensive about that question. So they retreat. They either go blank or they're looking for a way in making sure that they can give you the right answer when there really isn't a right answer. I'm asking the person about their experience. So let's go into, how do I get then further towards the authentic self through that pathway? Well, let me put it bluntly. It's not always easy because, even with the exercises that I suggested in the last session, we're going to encounter blockages, because we need to confront parts of ourselves that we've actually kept hidden away. To question the roles and identities that we've adopted over years. So keep this in mind. Sometimes the older we are, the harder it gets. And also because a lot of us suffer from a serious dose of confirmation bias. So it's my way or the highway because I know I am right. Well, as the saying goes, you can be right or you can be in a relationship, but you can't be both. But in questioning these aspects of ourselves, therein lies the journey to liberation. It is extraordinarily liberating to shed the confines, the shackles of the constructed persona or self that I've created through what society has taught me. And on that note,
this is me signing off. Love to hear from you. And if you're interested, please check out my work on www.gunterswoboda.com or www.goodmengreat.com.
Thank you for listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. For more information on the Making Good Men Great movement, or for individual or group coaching sessions with Gunter, visit goodmengreat.com. For inquiries regarding broadcast topics or appearing on the show, email Miranda@noirtainment.com. That's Miranda at NOIRTAINMENT.com.